I've spent the last 32 years studying the financial archives of the wealthiest families in the world. Not the public biographies, not the sanitized narratives written by their PR teams. I'm talking about the private letters, the estate documents, the family meeting minutes that were never meant for public consumption. And there's a pattern I found that almost nobody talks about. When a Jewish son turns 13, something very specific happens in certain families. Not in all of them, mind you, but in the ones that have managed to preserve and multiply wealth across generations. Families like the Rothschilds, the Lehmans, the Warburgs. There's a conversation that takes place. Sometimes it's formal, sometimes it's just a father and son in a study or during a walk. But the conversation is almost always the same. And it's never about working harder. It's never about saving more. It's about something entirely different. What I'm about to share with you comes from analyzing a principle embedded in the Talmud that has been strategically applied by the wealthiest Jewish families for nearly 2,000 years. But here's what's important to understand from the start. This isn't spiritual advice. This is financial architecture. This is how you build wealth that survives wars, depressions, and the deliberate attempts by others to take it from you. Let me start with a fact that most people don't know. During the financial panic of 1929, when the stock market collapsed and fortunes were being erased overnight, something unusual happened. While American families were jumping from office buildings and destroying their assets in panic, and the Rothschild family, who had already been managing wealth across European capitals for over a century, did something that seems almost mathematically impossible. They didn't just survive the Great Depression, they actually increased their net worth. How is that possible? How do you get richer when everyone around you is getting catastrophically poorer? The answer lies in a specific principle, and it's one that's not taught in business schools. It's not taught in finance departments. It's taught at 13 in private conversations between fathers and sons. I first encountered this principle in the Talmudic teaching found in Pirkei Avot, specifically in the concept of Shomer Peta'im. On the surface, it means guardian of the simple ones. But when you dig deeper into how wealthy Jewish families have interpreted it for centuries, it means something very specific. The man who protects what he has is greater than the man who acquires more. This seems counterintuitive. We live in a culture obsessed with growth, with expansion, with bigger. But the families that have preserved wealth across centuries understood something that Warren Buffett would later articulate perfectly. It's far better to buy a wonderful company at a fair price than a fair company at a wonderful price. Protection comes before expansion. This is the first conversation that happens when a son turns 13. Now, let me be concrete about what this means in practice. When Meyer Amschel Rothschild was building his banking empire in the late 1700s, he didn't just accumulate money, he created structures that protected that money. He didn't keep his wealth in one location. He didn't trust any single ruler or government. He distributed his sons across different European cities, Frankfurt, London, Vienna, Paris, Naples. This wasn't empire building in the traditional sense. This was diversification as a survival strategy. If France fell, the family still had London. If Austria collapsed, they still had Vienna. But here's the part that most business historians miss. This structure wasn't created because Rothschild was paranoid. It was created because he had studied history. He understood that empires fall, that currencies fail, that what seems permanent one generation is often gone the next. The Talmud teaches this in Ecclesiastes, which is part of the Jewish textual tradition, for there is a time and season for every matter under heaven. Wealth is not permanent. Structures must be built to survive when conditions change. Now jump forward to 2008. The financial crisis was unfolding. Bear Stearns had collapsed. Lehman Brothers, yes, that Lehman family, descendants of a long line of Jewish financiers, had filed for bankruptcy. The banking system was seizing up. Credit had frozen. Everywhere you looked, institutions that seemed too big to fail were failing. But something interesting happened. Warren Buffett, who had spent decades applying these exact same principles of protection and conservative positioning, went on a buying spree. While panic was selling, he was buying. Not because he was trying to be a contrarian for the sake of it, but because he had structured Berkshire Hathaway specifically to have excess cash reserves during normal times. He had protected his capital, which meant when opportunity came, he could act. This is the second principle that fathers tell their sons at 13. The man with dry powder wins. The man with cash, when everyone else is desperate, wins. You do not maximize growth. You maintain the ability to move when others cannot. Let me give you the exact Talmudic reference, because this is important. In the Mishnah, specifically Avot 2:7, there's a teaching. The more property, the more worry. The more wives, the more witchcraft. The more servants, the more theft. The more maidservants, the more immorality. The more Torah, the more life. The more schooling, the more wisdom. The more counsel, the more understanding. The more charity, the more peace. Now this seems like it's just saying that simplicity is better than excess. But when you look at how the Warburg family, one of the most sophisticated banking families in history, organized themselves, you see the practical application. They didn't expand infinitely. They maintained relatively lean operations. They had advisory boards, not massive management hierarchies. They asked for counsel before moving. They maintained relationships based on mutual benefit rather than size. This protected them. When other banks got overextended and took on catastrophic risk, the Warburgs had already decided their operational ceiling. They knew their limits, and knowing your limits is how you survive disruptions that destroy competitors who don't. Here's a retention hook that most people miss. The wealthiest families don't think about money the way you do. They don't think about it the way your employer thinks about it. They think about it as flowing through systems. Their job isn't to make money. Their job is to maintain and structure the systems that make money, so that those systems continue working even when they're not actively involved. This is why J.P. Morgan, in the late 1800s, could command such enormous influence. He didn't build his power on personal deals. He built it on being the person who could see the structure beneath the chaos. During the Panic of 1893, when the US Treasury was running out of gold and the entire financial system was on the verge of collapse, Morgan assembled a consortium of financiers and stabilized the situation. Not because he was altruistic, because he understood that the structure of finance is ultimately a collective agreement about trust. If that structure collapses, everyone loses, including him. But if you're the person positioned to protect that structure, your value becomes indispensable. The third principle that fathers tell their sons at 13 relates directly to this. Never confuse your personal money with structural money. Your personal wealth is fragile, but if you understand the structures, the debt arrangements, the credit mechanisms, the insurance frameworks, the legal entities, you can position yourself inside those structures in a way that's nearly impossible to dislodge. This comes from the Torah teaching of tzedakah, but not in the way it's commonly understood. Tzedakah is often translated as charity, but the actual Hebrew root means justice or righteousness. In practical financial terms, the wealthy Jewish families understood this as, your obligation is not to give money away generously when you feel like it. Your obligation is to structure your affairs so that wealth naturally flows in ways that benefit you. And incidentally, some of that flows through legitimate charitable and community structures, which then create obligation and debt in the social order. This is why the Rothschilds were able to operate in countries that had actively persecuted Jews centuries before. It's because they had provided financing to those countries. They had literally structured their position so that governments owed them money. You cannot exile someone who has loaned you the currency to fight wars. You cannot revoke his property if his family is the only credit mechanism you have access to. Now, I want to be extremely clear about something. I'm not describing malice. I'm describing structural awareness. When you turn 13 and your father sits down with you and talks about money, he's not describing a scheme. He's describing how power actually works underneath the surface. He's describing that economics is not the same as morality, and that if you want to preserve your family's position across generations, you need to understand both without confusing them. The fourth principle is this: knowledge compounds faster than money. This is why Jewish families historically invested in education, not just any education, but specific financial and legal education. The Rothschilds didn't just have sons who inherited their wealth. They had sons who understood double-entry bookkeeping before they could read. They understood credit arrangements. They understood currency valuations. They understood how to spot structural weakness in a competitor's business model. When Warren Buffett talks about his investment philosophy, he's essentially describing what Jewish financial families have been doing for centuries. He reads constantly. He studies businesses, not to impress people, but because understanding the actual mechanics of how a company makes money is worth more than any market tip. He can read a balance sheet and tell you whether a business is sustainable in 5 years. That's not intuition. That's knowledge that compounds. Here's what I discovered in the family documents. Fathers don't tell their sons to invest in the stock market. They tell their sons to understand why certain businesses work, to study the balance sheet, and to know the difference between revenue and profit. To understand that a company with declining margins is a failing company, no matter what the stock price suggests in any given month. The Great Depression of 1929 is a perfect laboratory for understanding this. Millions of people lost everything, but the people who had spent time understanding how business actually works, not reading tips in newspapers, but genuinely understanding the structure of commerce, they saw it coming. They had already positioned themselves. By the time the panic hit, they were simply waiting for prices to become ridiculous, at which point they bought. This is why the Lehman family, despite the eventual collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008, had maintained family wealth for generations before that. The institution failed, but the family's personal wealth, properly structured and diversified, was protected. That's the difference between personal competence and institutional competence. You build your competence so that you don't depend on any single institution. The fifth principle, and this is where it gets interesting, is understanding the difference between price and value. There's a famous Talmudic concept called ona'at devarim, which is often translated as causing pain through words. But in financial circles, it's understood as the obligation to honestly represent value in a transaction. Not out of morality, but out of structural understanding. If you develop a reputation for dishonesty, your access to capital in the future diminishes catastrophically. This is why the Rothschilds, operating in multiple countries and religions, built a reputation for keeping their word. And their word was literally backed by their structure. When they made a promise about credit, it was good. When they represented a value, they had studied it carefully. This made them the preferred lender, the preferred partner, the preferred alliance maker. In a world where communication was slow and trust was everything, a reputation for truthfulness wasn't a moral stance. It was a competitive advantage worth millions. Now here's what's not taught in schools and what most financial advisors won't tell you. Building wealth is not primarily about earning more. It's about understanding what holds value and what doesn't. It's about knowing which assets are real and which are illusions. It's about understanding that in 1929, stocks seemed valuable until they didn't. In 2008, non-mortgage-backed securities seemed valuable until the structure collapsed. The families that survived these periods didn't survive because they were lucky. They survived because someone had taken the time to actually understand the underlying mechanics. Someone had asked the question, What happens if everyone tries to exit this trade at the same time? And if the answer was catastrophe, they had already reduced their exposure. This brings me to what I consider the most important principle of all, and it's rarely discussed explicitly. It's embedded in the Talmudic concept of Dina de Malkuta Dina. The law of the land is law. But understood properly, this means understand and work within the existing structures of power. Don't fight them directly. Position yourself inside them. This is why Jewish families didn't become major landowners in medieval Europe, even though they often had the capital. Land ownership meant you had to enforce your own power, and as a minority you couldn't do that. Instead, they became lenders to landowners. They became merchants. They became the people who moved capital between locations. They became indispensable to the structure rather than trying to be the structure. Fast forward to today, and this principle has evolved, but the underlying logic remains. You don't fight the tax code, you understand it and position yourself within it legally. You don't oppose monetary policy, you understand how it works and position yourself to benefit from it. This isn't cynicism, it's structural awareness. I want to leave you with something concrete, something actionable. Not because following it will make you instantly rich, it won't, but because understanding it is the difference between being financially naive and being financially aware. Here is what a 13-year-old is actually told in these conversations, broken down into actionable principles. First, understand that protection comes before expansion. Build your knowledge before you risk your capital. Structure your affairs so that no single loss can destroy you. Second, maintain flexibility. Keep reserves. Never maximize utilization. The man with options wins. Third, understand the difference between personal wealth and structural wealth. Fourth, invest time in learning how business actually works. Read financial statements, understand margins, understand whether something is sustainable. Fifth, and protect your reputation for honesty because it's worth more than any single transaction. And sixth, understand the law and the existing power structures and position yourself within them strategically. This is not a get-rich-quick manual. This is how families have preserved and multiplied wealth while everyone around them lost it. This is what separates generational wealth from the lottery winners who lose everything in 10 years. This is the conversation that happens at 13. And if you want the detailed frameworks that show how these principles apply to your specific situation, how to actually structure your finances, how to position yourself, how to think about risk and opportunity, I've created something that walks through this systematically. Not theory, real structures, real strategies, real examples from the families who have actually done this. The difference between knowing this information and acting on it is the difference between being one of millions of people who understand how wealth works and being one of the few who actually builds it. That choice, ultimately, is yours.